Together we don't stand. There is power in our union. Now the lessons of the past were all learned with workers' blood. Mistakes of the bosses we must pay for. From the cities and the farmlands to trenches full of mud. War's always been the bosses' way, sir. The union forever defending our rights. Down with the black leg, all workers unite. With our brothers and our sisters from many far off lands. There is power in our union.
Okay, sorry.
All right, ready to get rolling?
Yep.
Okay, so I'd like to welcome everybody. My name is Sparrow Tobin. I'm president of the Hudson Valley Area Labor Federation. We represent over 100,000 workers in the Hudson Valley in the 7-county region. I'd like to thank our Ed Committee and our honored guests for participating in tonight's discussion. I'd like to specifically thank our co-chairs, Donna Goodman and Beth Wilson, for helping to organize this, and Richard Burton and our director, Sandy Oxford, for helping. So in creating these First Fridays, we wanted to create a space where we can talk about what we want the future to look like. Our economy, our schools, our healthcare. It was actually the seed, the idea came from Donna Goodman. And we developed this into an idea of bargaining for the common good. We are bargaining for the common good by checking corporate power, defending our vital institutions, and discussing and promoting policies that will help working people. Today, we're talking about defending our public institutions, our schools, K-12 and higher ed. Schools are the great equalizers in our society. They help people move up the social ladder, which was unheard of even 100 or 200 years ago. They're engines of opportunities in our schools and in our communities, and they don't make profits. I know sometimes the people on the right want to, they want our nursing homes to make a profit, our post office to make a profit, maybe our schools to make a profit, but we're not about making a profit. We don't make profits, but our profit is our products, our students. We're educating the next generation of scientists, carpenters, nurses, teachers, our future leaders. But now we find ourselves in a crisis, COVID, a worldwide pandemic, and shine a light on the cracks in our system, the inequities, but also has made more visible some of the long-standing inequities, the walking back for a long time of our commitment to these vital institutions that serve the common good. And so, what kind of future do we want for education? Today, we're going to talk about the importance of education and how to strengthen it and where do we go from here. And so, thank you for participating. You're always welcome to get involved with the Labor Federation. And I'd like to pass the torch to Donna Goodman.
Thank you, Sparrow. So hi, everyone, and welcome to our Labor Day Labor Forum. This evening's topic, as Sparrow said, is education. We'll hear from a range of area educators and activists who will engage in conversation on the exceptional challenges facing us, not only in surviving the pandemic, but also in making the fundamental structural changes that will be necessary in our approach to public education and its funding moving forward if we hope to enable the full potential of all our young people. There are many categories of education workers, and only some could be represented here today. Others will be featured at future education forums. The pandemic has exposed deep inequities in our education system, and these are inequities that will only grow as the state budget for education is cut yet another 20%, disproportionately disadvantaging the poor, the working class, and Black and brown students. Just as schools reopened during a pandemic, and as our governor refuses to support a tax hike on billionaires. Education is provided by workers for the benefit of future workers. How do we and how should we educate the future working class? The big question the pandemic is forcing us to consider as a society is, what is education even for? Leaders of both parties like to say, we're preparing students to compete in the global economy. Is that it? Or is education the place where young people learn to live with austerity, racialized austerity at that, where they learn the really low value our society places on the young, collective action for the common good? As the rich get richer and billionaires race to become trillionaires, disinvestment in and privatization of public services take for granted that the state can't afford to invest in public services, and that taxing the rich is not a solution because they'll just up and leave New York. Is the purpose of education job training as we experience a gross hemorrhage of jobs? With a reduced economy, we're experiencing a reduced need for workers, but only if we define work as that which produces a profit, not work that society needs in order to rebuild. Workers can rebuild this economy. Workers can rebuild the public sector, but who will pay? What about taxing the billionaires, regulating the private sector, legislating higher wages, supporting unions, and ending corporate welfare? What about moving tax revenues from war to education, healthcare, and infrastructure? So let's ask our question a different way, and let's listen as our panelists respond from the perspectives of their own expertise and experience. What would an education system that is truly for the common good look like, especially in light of chronic underfunding, the implications of COVID-19, and the critical need to dismantle institutionalized racism? What long-term and immediate steps do you recommend that concerned people can take collectively to move our education system in the right direction? And how can our education system, given all its challenges and obstacles, including the pandemic, prepare young people to take part in society to change society? Our first panelist is Jasmine Gripper. Jasmine is the executive director of the statewide advocacy group Alliance for Quality Education, AQE. Jasmine initially embarked on a career as an educator, but shifted to advocacy after realizing that education policies steeped in inequity were harming children and limiting their potential. In order to effect genuine change and address the growing opportunity gap, it was time for a career shift. Jasmine moved to Cleveland to work as field organizer for Obama's 2012 re-election campaign. In 2013, she joined the team at AQE, a perfect combination for her background in education and organizing. In 2016, she was named as one of City and State's 40 under 40 rising stars, and in 2020 made the Education Power 100 list. Jasmine is dedicated to empowering parents, students, and community members to dismantle systemic racism in education and to create well-resourced, high-quality, culturally relevant community schools in every Black and Brown neighborhood. Jasmine, welcome.
Thank you for having me, and what a great group to be with on Labor Day weekend. So really happy to be with you all. I think you were talking about a really tough question to tackle. What do we want our schools to really be? What should they look like? What should they feel like? And Sparrow started saying that education is supposed to be the great equalizer. And that's what it should be. But it really is not. And what we need our schools to be is actually to be the great equalizer. And too much time is spent focusing on the outcomes in schools, the achievement gap, and too little time is spent on focus on the inputs in schools, which is the opportunity gap, right? That students from low-income neighborhoods, Black students, brown students, immigrant students, don't have access to the same resources and opportunities as their peers in wealthy, majority white communities. And what we need to do is actually get to the heart of the issue, which is funding equity. Consistently, we see it here in New York State. New York State ranks near the bottom of the nation when it comes to education equity. Our white suburban districts are outspending our high-need public districts, high-need Black and brown districts, by about $10,000 per pupil when you combine state, local, and federal dollars. So that means the students who need it the most, who cost the most to educate, are getting $10,000 less per child, and therefore their needs are not being addressed. And so our system was strained pre-COVID, and now that the pandemic has hit, it's just exposed the inequalities even more and brought them to the surface. And so we need to end the inequity, the built-in inequity that we have in school funding, that disproportionately helps the privileged and doesn't do enough to support the students with the greatest need. We need to take a hard look at school climate and culture. What is happening in our school buildings, how children are being treated, who is talking to them, and how they're being spoken to. AQE deeply believes that our schools should be police-free. Students should be supported with restorative justice approaches. They need counselors, not cops. And we need to take a look at community schools. Community schools is a model that has been shown to work when done well. And not just adding the label onto the school, but when the school really takes the time to address the comprehensive needs of the students and their families. When you take the time to do a needs resource survey to hear what the parents want, hear what the students want, hear what the educators want, and then create a school community that addresses those specific needs for not just the children, but for everyone around the area. And then the other thing that's deeply important that New York State was getting right and needed to do better on was early childhood education. We were making great strides in that direction, making paths forward to full day universal pre-K. And what we see right now in this pandemic with the 20% withholdings, this is the first time in a very long time that pre-K is now being cut. And that withholding is devastating. You do not get a second chance to be a 3-year-old in a high quality pre-K classroom. You do not get a second chance to be a 4-year-old in pre-K. So kids are missing out on these strategic learning opportunities that are absolutely essential to their long-term growth and development. AQE was created from the Campaign for Fiscal Equity lawsuit, steeped in equity, right? When parents sued New York State because students weren't receiving a sound basic education. Parents won that lawsuit, and yet and still we're still fighting for those dollars. So pre-pandemic, New York State owed our schools nearly $4 billion statewide. Now that we're looking at these 20% cuts, that is about $5.5 billion being lost in our schools in 1 year. This is catastrophic. If you think back to the last financial crisis, when schools lost $1 billion the first year, and about a little bit more than $1 billion the second year. Those cuts were devastating. And combined over 2 years, schools only lost about $2.5 billion. We're talking about $5.5 billion at one time to our schools. This is absolutely catastrophic. Just this week, AQE released a report around the 20% cuts. It's called Set Up to Fail. How Cuomo's cuts target Black and brown students. It really shows that a 20% cut is inequitable, that the students in the high need communities that depend on state aid are going to feel the cut the most. They're going to lose about $2,000 per pupil, and the wealthy school districts that are not heavily reliant on state aid are only losing about $800 per pupil. And New York State can do better. We point out in that report that there is a Ohio Republican governor who made cuts, and what he said is we have to protect the most vulnerable students, and they cut 1% from the high need districts and 40% in state aid from the wealthy districts. If an Ohio Republican governor can figure it out, then Governor Andrew Cuomo can surely do better than across the board 20% cut. One of the things that we're calling for immediately is for New York State to tap into its rainy day funds. This is a rainy day. It is pouring right now and our school districts are in crisis. The state has billions of dollars stashed away. Tap into that now while we are waiting for the federal government to act to stop these cuts from going into effect. And then our longer term solution, of course, is taxing the ultra rich and raising revenue for New York State so that we can fully fund our schools. AQE has been supportive of the Robert Jackson bill that taxes those who make $1 million or more, and also the Shelley Mayer bill, 2 bills that put the money, sets aside the money specifically for education. And so we know budgets are about priorities and they're about choices. Governor Cuomo has been a fierce advocate for the ultra rich and New York's millionaires, and he refuses to touch them. Yet he thinks our schools are fair game. He thinks in the middle of a pandemic, our hospitals can stand to lose. Those are the wrong priorities. And so we're pressuring the state legislature. I'm gonna plug some things into the chat that AQE is doing. We're doing statewide rallies September 12th in Buffalo, Rochester, the Capital Region, Utica, Hudson Valley, and New York City, and we hope folks will join us to stop the Cuomo cuts and make sure our schools get the full funding they deserve. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. That was not only informative, but very moving, and thank you for being an advocate for education. Our next speaker is Bianca Tanis. She's a parent, a teacher, and a Board of Ed member, and she's going to use her introduction time to tell us everything that she knows in the time she has. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me here. I'm happy to be here because in the midst of all of this conversation feels hopeful in some ways because we have a chance to make some changes. And I think what we're seeing right now is really the disinvestment in public education, like coming home to roost. For all the reasons, so many painful truths are being laid bare, and Jasmine mentioned many of them. And within all of this, there's this pining to go back to normal, right? Like we hear, I just want things to go back to normal. I just want to go back to school. But I think that one of those painful truths that's bubbling to the surface is that we have not been meeting the needs of the most vulnerable students. And that is so obvious right now. And we're finding that we're not even doing such a great job identifying those needs. So I think, that when we're talking about going back to normal, we have to shift to reimagining, because normal has not worked for so many students. Normal has not worked for students with disabilities. I'm a parent of a child with autism. Normal has not worked for Black and brown students. It has not worked for our newcomers. It has not worked for our ENL students. So we really have an opportunity. I'm wearing different hats. I'm a parent and a board member and a teacher. And one of the things that's really struck me throughout the pandemic is that a lot of these walls that we keep up and these boundaries have been coming down. So as a teacher, we've had to go deeper with the families we work with to identify needs and to make sure that families have what they need. We're all being invited into each other's homes. School districts have had to jump into community partnerships that in the past they probably would have been really tentative about. So I think, all of these walls coming down, it's forcing us to really see the gaps and to go deeper. And I think that's, when we talk about reimagining schools, for the public good, I think that's a powerful focal point to look at. We need to dismantle schools and rebuild them based on relationships and going into communities and figuring out what the needs are. What do communities need? What I want for my child out of public education might be different than what you want, and figuring out what families and communities need. And just, building it from the ground up. Our structures of public schools are very top down. And I think this is an opportunity to revisit that. And any reimagining really has to be based on racial and economic justice, because if we're not willing to build up based on that, we're sort of, it's kind of game over. And I think our schools right now, schools feel like they're built around a lot of standards and rules and accountability metrics and policies and liabilities. And a lot of those, our model of school was based on the Industrial Revolution, and all of these norms and rules and policies and mandates that schools are built around, even though I know I know Dr. Rosa has been working very hard to examine these, but a lot of these are really built in white supremacy and white norms. And it's going to take a lot to unpack all of those policies and see who they benefit and who they're not benefiting. So I feel hopeful that we're in this moment, and I hope that it's not squandered. And I hope conversations like this continue because, it's difficult to bring people together to talk about reimagining when you're in crisis. When people are talking about, how am I going to pay my mortgage? I don't have childcare. Where is this coming from? So, and eventually this crisis is going to pass, and it will be too easy to slip back into normalcy. As a teacher, I feel like teachers, we're on the front lines, and that's a really powerful position to push for these voices to be heard, to amplify, policies and practices that begin with the needs of our students, and to rebuild schools around that serve the needs of those who have not been served. We talk about schools that meet the needs of everyone, but I think we have to rethink that and start building based on those who have not been served. Because when we do that, it will trickle out and you're really meeting the needs of everyone. In terms of how do we get there, all of the things that Jasmine mentioned, I think our current system is designed to pit taxpayers against school districts, to pit employers against employees, employers against unions. And that really is just such a bait and switch. It's like, look over here, let's not address, where the real power is and where the money is. And, I feel like as a teacher and as a board member, as a parent, a lot of what I try to do is to push people to look at, where do we really need to focus our energy? And right now it's school funding. We really need to push the governor to pass, one of these bills that are in the legislature and the assembly, to really tax the rich and fully fund our schools. And looking down the road, we really have to look at how we fund public education in general. As long as we're funding public education on property taxes, we are reinventing this really inherently inequitable system. But that's a huge conversation, and that's when I think, let's just get those bills passed. Let's get our schools fully funded, and then we need to talk about that. But I really think that schools, public schools, we want to give the image of having it all together. And schools, I think, very often are afraid to really, to be very frank about what the needs are in our schools. So I think as educators, as board members, we really need to start talking about these issues and making them really transparent. And I hope that these conversations continue, because this moment's going to pass. And like so many of the movements that are happening right now, it's really an opportunity. So thank you for having me. And I look forward to hearing what everyone else has to say.
Thanks so much, Bianca, for joining us and for all this insight that you have. Our next panelist is Anthony Dandridge. Anthony is a charter member of the SUNY Black Faculty and Staff Collective at New Paltz. He's an Africologist in the Department of Black Studies, and his major interests revolve around African and African American philosophy, a field with a vast history of engaging issues of race, religion, gender, environmentalism, and justice, among other topics. He believes that any discipline or any people has obligations to the well-being and growth of other disciplines or people, and looks forward to growing here with his extended family at SUNY New Paltz. Anthony, we're happy to have you. Take it away. Are we frozen? Can someone unmute? Anthony, can you unmute yourself? It's your turn. Okay, great.
Are you ready to go, Anthony?
We're ready to listen.
Now, was that uncomfortable? Because silence is uncomfortable. The silence is real. Right? It's important for us to understand that systems of injustice and racism are like a moving train. Being passive tends to ensure the existence of these racialized inequities that exist. Silence never occurs in a void. It takes up space. It's real. So when you ask me, are you okay? Are you ready, Anthony? I started already. Your silences right now are shaping the world. Things that you are doing and not doing are impacting people. Those disparities that exist that we talked about within racialized contexts, the lacks of funding, those inequities that exist in a variety of different spaces are constantly impacting individuals' lives. So silence is real. Martin Luther King said that in the end, you will not remember the words of your enemies, but the silence of your friends. Einstein also said that if I would have remained silent, I would be guilty of complicity. In a world in which we are all connected and everything is together, right? This interdependent world, in some levels, we are all responsible for everybody else. Because the things that we do and the things that we don't do consistently impact everybody else. So what does it mean to be a human being within that particular context? That's the fundamental question. But even a bigger question, where do you learn these different things? What does it mean to be a university? What does it mean to be an educational system in that kind of a context? When we start speaking about the different ways in which knowledge production manifests itself. Silence is real. Certain voices are being amplified while others are being silenced and marginalized. Not just individuals, but also those individuals' cultures, where they came from. So for instance, if you wanted to look at African culture and the different ways in which they understood the purpose of education, the purpose of education was not to speed through a 4-year program and get a job to get paid. It was rather to become a person and learn how to live in harmony with others and with nature. Right. Not with just with other individuals, but also with nature. And this orientation speaks to things such as environmental justice, sustainability initiatives, racial and economic justice, so on and so forth. And as I like to amplify those voices that always tend to get marginalized and silenced, James Baldwin, he talked about how education should teach you to do what? To think for yourself. He said in a social network, in society, it's a hard thing to do, to think for yourself. It sounds real simple, but once you start to tease it out, it's not as simple as what you may think it is, because human beings are social beings. While we are in the womb, we are being shaped. The health of that mother impacts the health of that baby. Martin Luther King then goes on to talk about, well, what does he think about what the value, what the goal of education is? He says the goal of education is that education should teach you to think critically. And he said, and he made a criticism. He was talking about, we have individuals coming with 5 beta kappa keys in America right now, and at the same time saying that Martin Luther King or Black people are inferior beings. So if you're talking about individuals that have achieved the epitome of this educational system, what does it mean for you to be a part of the education system and still come out of it and think that I am inferior and think that I am less than? What is this education system teaching individuals? At the end, in short, the goals are equal access, equal representation, and equal outcomes. As a member of the SUNY Black faculty and staff, we actually put together a variety of different initiatives or recommendations going forward. I just wanted to address some of those things. We would like the university system, SUNY as a whole, to engage the advancement of the increasing racial diversity across SUNY campuses. The preservation of SUNY faculty and staff employment, especially Black faculty and staff in key areas of support for Black students such as EOP, CSTEP, CAMP, and to maintain further advancement within SUNY progress as we attempt to become a more racially diverse faculty and staff. We would like them to establish and invest in the SUNY-wide Educational and Research Institute with a mission to support Black scholars led by qualified instructors. We would like a reevaluation of the job description and working conditions and the mission of the Chief Diversity Officers going forward. Students also should be required to take a course in race studies or anti-racism within their first 3 semesters. Race-centered classes create necessary dialogue for students to critically and analytically think about Black and brown experiences of people that are written by and or for Black and brown peoples. I can't tell you how many times that I've taught these classes in Black studies, and I've been teaching for about 20 years now in the university system, about how many times I've had students come to me graduating and say, I wish I would have took one of these courses the first year. This stuff changes lives. It's particularly transformative. I talk to my students about a variety of different issues. A couple things that have just happened just this semester is that one student said to me, an Asian student said to me, I'm here because my family calls all of these people, all Black people, niggers, and I don't like it. And she's whispering as her family is in the next room. Right, so you have these stories. That's just one story. That just happened 4 or 5 days ago. Right? But then how can unions actually contribute to this? And I'm about to wrap this up. Right? I'm a union member. I pay my dues. That's right. Yeah. There you go. But unions are good for a variety of different things. Organizing, they push for wages, benefits, and progressive policies. Right. In some sense, the story of American labor is grounded in the enslavement of people of African descent and the treatment of Black workers in the South. W.E.B. Du Bois researched how labor unions were able to come together with Black people, white people, for greater gains, right? This practice of radical empathy, where the common good is at the center, is a reflection of our common interests and our common diversity as we embrace what? As we embrace difference as ourselves. There exists an unconscious bias that's located around racism in America, right? That tends to promote these vast disparities. And also, and many times, it's also conscious too. It's important for us to understand that the most valuable social reforms that have been developed in this nation were achieved by people who came together, embraced one another, to change society for the better. Whether we're talking about the New Deal that was established by the Roosevelt administration or the Kennedy administration and investments in infrastructure, retirement security, access to college and healthcare. With Obama, the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay, Affordable Care Act. Labor unions and Black people came together, united for change. Those were significant moments. Even the March on Washington in 1963 was called the March for Jobs and Freedom. When Martin Luther King was actually killed, he was organizing the Memphis sanitation workers, right? So the story of labor in America and the way in which it is grounded with respect to the enslavement of people of African descent and racism is real complex, but it is always shown that when Black people come together, when marginalized people come together, whether or not they are being involved in educational systems, whether they are being involved in other forms of labor, they always make significant advances. So how can we attempt to address those advances in ways in which we come together and form coalitions and bond with one another and make these significant advances very real? Thank you very much. And I always like to say, I don't need to know you to love you, all right? But I would like to continue this conversation as we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony, and thank you for your words and for your silence. It was a wonderful. Thank you. Our next speaker is Juanita Sarmiento. She's part of the Rural Migrant Ministry in Sullivan County. She's the Youth Economic Group Coordinator for RMM. Please welcome Juanita.
Hello, how are you? So I'm here taking place for one of my youth members who unfortunately couldn't be here today due to a family emergency. But I guess some points I want to make, and I won't take long at all, is that, you know, education right now during the pandemic is something that we really have to sit down and think about. And as many people have mentioned before, families are inviting you into their homes, right? So teachers are going to be seeing things and hearing things that their students have never mentioned before. And these things may be stressful to the students themselves. So patience is one of the biggest things that we have to worry about right now, is being patient with our young people. I get to speak to them out of a school environment, and a lot of the things I've heard from young people, from children in the schools right now, is that they're very stressed out. You know, sometimes they can't connect to the internet. Some locations, like in Sullivan County, we're in a broadband desert, which is something that our local senators are working on really hard to make sure that we have internet and cell phone access in these rural areas. But a lot of rural areas where Black and brown children and immigrant children live in have really terrible access to internet. And this just exasperates the fact that we're living in a pandemic, trying to manage school at the same time. And, you know, there was an image the other day posted of these two little kids sitting in the Wendy's parking lot because that was the only place they could access internet. They were in their pajamas together by themselves. Another thing I read earlier today was that Child Protective Services is being called more often now because you can hear parents yelling in the background or older siblings fighting in the background. And this is also causing, you know, more stress in the families, more stress in the households. So these are all factors that need to be considered right now. And like it was mentioned multiple times, we need to be able to invest in our students. We need to be able to invest in wider internet access, safer ways to handle school right now, because I'm sure we're going to be living in this for a while. I don't expect us to be out of this anytime soon. And we need people investing in our local public schools. I think that's all I have to say for today. And, you know, I love this partnership that we have. So thank you all for having me.
Thank you, Juanita. Thank you for filling in at the last minute and contributing this wonderful talk. Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Chris Livecchi. Chris is an adjunct professor in the Department of Geography at SUNY New Paltz, where he's been teaching since January 2014. He received his PhD in geography from Penn State, and his research interests include the intersections of home, mobility, and militarization. Also the cultural landscapes of the Cold War and spaces of the uncanny. In addition to teaching, he works in the food and beverage industry and owns a small comic book shop in Kingston where he lives with his family, and some of that family is right here on camera right now. Hi. But just while that sounds really interesting, oh, the comic book and food and beverage and adjunct, wait a minute. He's an adjunct professor in college and has to work 3 jobs. So let's not let that pass us by. Chris tells us that if you ever meet him on the street, don't ask him where he's from unless you want a TED Talk on the nature of home. Chris, welcome.
Thank you. Sorry, I know this is a little bit hectic. This is one of the, but you're seeing basically one of the impacts of being an adjunct professor, who is part of a 2-professor household. My wife is a recently tenured professor who is actually working at the comic book shop right now so that I can do this. So just to sort of, as Donna pointed out, I'm an adjunct, which means that hey, I was talking, okay? Wave hi, everybody. No. Okay, then let Boba talk. So I work like 3 different jobs. I've got a PhD, and I think a lot of my students, hey, if you're not gonna be quiet, you gotta go. Go play. No. No, okay. Discipline, right? Okay. I'm from a military family. You'd think I'd be a lot, tougher, but I'm a big mush. But yeah, so, I'm working 3 different jobs. I have the same credentials as any other professor in my department. In fact, I've got more credentials than some. And I think my students don't really fully appreciate and understand what it means, the nature of being an adjunct professor, which is that you're constantly hustling. It's a gig. You have very little stability. You are silly. Okay, can you go watch TV? No. If you're gonna sit here, can you be quiet so Bubba can talk? Okay, thanks. So one of the major problems that I see as a professor, and as an adjunct professor, I see a lot of the same things that a lot of other professors do, which is I see a lot of students coming in who their first question for me is, what kind of job can I get with fill in the blank degree? And to me, that's indicative of some bigger trends that are happening in American culture that have been going on for decades, but are just getting worse and worse and are exacerbated under COVID. So one thing that I've noticed is that Americans as a group do not value education as an ongoing, lifelong process, but they see it as some sort of commodity and as a means to an end. This is, part and parcel of the growing anti-intellectualism that I've seen in this country that I've been paying attention to over the last 30 years, and a distrust for expertise, even among our politicians, which I've watched grow in Congress for, again, like 20 or 30 years. It's absolutely ridiculous. Universities, meanwhile, seem to think that the way to lure students in is not with the promise of a good education, but with a new pool or a new gym or an award-winning sports team. And I don't want to denigrate those things. I think that athletics can be really important to university and to an education. But to me, the point of going to college is to get an education. And not to get an education to get a particular job, but to get an education to be an educated, thoughtful, critical thinking, as so many other people have pointed out here, critical thinking participant in the world. Not just in terms of politics, but even in terms of personal decisions and the ability to empathize with other people, which I think is something that comes from a good education in part. All of these things also continue, like even though education is theoretically in the process of helping the most vulnerable people, it also continues to disenfranchise them through reliance on textbook companies who gouge students and who control the discourses of things like history and all manner of disciplines, and often in ways that denigrate people or that erase people, which is not right. But also there's an increasing reliance on technology as a kind of panacea, and we see this to such an incredible degree at the university level in the midst of COVID, where I am teaching by Zoom every week to students who cannot physically appreciate the demonstrations that I'm giving them, where I can't see where the energy of the classroom is gone. And I think there's this idea that, well, we can solve everything through technology. I would argue that there are a couple of things that need to happen in this country with regard to education, and it ties both university and sort of pre-collegiate issues together. One of which is we need a cultural shift, okay, in which Americans change how we think about education. We need less emphasis on what job can I get and more emphasis on the other benefits of education that I've already kind of talked about, like critical thinking, being able to parse information that helps you fight for people's rights and make strong political decisions and identify issues in the world that need to be addressed by policy, and to critique discourses of power, which is something that's really lacking in a lot of mainstream American sort of life. And we need to value education over the frills, okay? Now, in terms of policies, we need to act less like for-profit institutions at the university level. And we need to actually embrace education as our mission. Okay, so what this means to me is, it means reducing the workload creep that has crept up for professors across the spectrum, which means not just teaching and research, but also counseling students. We are often the first line of mental health for a number of students who come to us for help. And we end up spending a lot of time redirecting students to other services. Maybe, you know, what we need to do is reevaluate the kinds of things that we're offering to students, because there's also a lot of administrative bloat that we see in universities, where instead of funding tenure lines and instead of funding and adequately paying instructors, first off, whether they're adjunct or tenure track, but also like just having tenure lines where people can continue to teach and provide a certain amount of stability for their students. Instead, that money is going toward increasing numbers of administrative positions. And often, often those administrative positions are for services that are sort of, beneficial, but maybe could be streamlined and made more efficient. We need more tenure track jobs. The reliance on adjunct faculty, about 70% of faculty in the United States currently are contingent, and about 50% are adjuncts, which is an absurd amount of faculty who don't have the opportunity to provide stability for their students. We often lack offices. I don't even have a phone in my office. Thankfully, I have an office and a computer, but I don't have a phone my students can call. Little things like that we can do to sort of strengthen university education. I think we need to go smaller, ultimately. And I think we need to reduce the level of complexity that we see in university systems. And I could go on for days, but I'm gonna stop there. And thank you all.
Thank you, Chris. And I know you could go on, and so could we. The life of an adjunct is one of the great unknowns in the public. People don't understand what it's like. They see the word professor and they think privilege, and they have no idea what you folks go through. So thank you for letting us know. The final speaker will be Dr. Betty Rosa. And after her presentation, we'll move into the Q&A section and discussion, and that will be led by Beth. Please be sure to enter your questions and comments into the chat so we can hear what you want to say. So Betty Rosa is the newly appointed Interim Commissioner of New York State Education Department. But Dr. Rosa came up through the ranks. She started as a bilingual paraprofessional, went on to be a teacher and reading coordinator. She served as an assistant principal. She's developed programs. She developed schools, community schools. She's developed schools that have won state awards. She's taught graduate level education courses and law courses, and has really served in the whole gamut of education, and fully deserves to now be running the show. And we welcome Dr. Rosa. One other thing that I just want to say is that Dr. Rosa is an advocate for education. And when we get into the Q&A section, we talk about what we want people to do and what we want ourselves to do. We would really like for Dr. Rosa to let us know what she needs and what kind of support she needs so that she can continue in this high-level position to advocate for education with all of us. So, Dr. Rosa, welcome.
Thank you so much. I think first and foremost, I want to give a shout out for my colleague, my friend, Regent Josephine Finn, who I know is listening to this amazing conversation. So I really want to acknowledge that this work gets really, takes place with a sense of community. And so I want to start there because a couple of people mentioned that word community, and in the word itself, you have the word common and unity. And we do not spend enough time in really dissecting what what that means. I think the other conversation was about teaching our students and preparing them, not only in terms of creative thinking, the mind, and sometimes it's the mind, the heart, and the soul. And many, many times, and by the way, when you went silent, I said, I know exactly what he's doing. So you didn't fool me for 1 second. And your silence helped me connect to thinking about the single story. How many times in education we really focus on the single story? And the silence is so connected to the fact that we allowed that single story to persist. And so I truly believe that we can spend an enormous amount of time and we can have conversations. And those of us who focus on the fiscal because we know investments are really important. Those of us who focus on infrastructure and structure know, because guess what? Those are very important. Those of us who focus on culture and language know that culture, the broader sense of culture, the fact that many times we don't even understand that term culture. We use it so loosely. But the fact is, when we think about humanity, human connectivity, it isn't about technology. Human connectivity is so critical. It's so critical in society, in our communities. It is so critical in our spaces called schools. Too many times we erect these walls and we make determinations of who we allow in and who we dismiss, and make sure that they do not even enter. And if they do enter, we do everything possible to make sure they exit early on, without the skills, without the support, without the opportunities to be successful. So during this pandemic, I've had an opportunity to think about my own sense of where I've been, my own journey. And so for tonight, I decided to share a little bit of that journey, and that journey in terms of equity, and looking at what that journey looks like. I have been very blessed that I ran the first community school, a community school that started at 7:30 in the morning and went to 10 p.m., had dental clinics, had everything you can imagine, from mental health services, a partnership with Children's Aid Society, a partnership with the community, because the dental clinic was not just for the student who attended my school, but it was for the family. A partnership that looked at housing, because housing was important to support our students. And then I want to quickly go to, and I will share some of these pieces because we were, in fact, our School 218 in Washington Heights was featured by Harvard in 1996, saying, in 1996, why can't schools look like this? Where is the investment to make sure that community, back to that word, community, schools had a common purpose and were grounded in these neighborhoods with, obviously, the support of the entire faculty of that community. Later on, I went on to think about inclusive environments, inclusive schools that clearly responded to both students with special needs, students, English language learners, all kinds of students, and all of our schools need to be inclusive, not exclusive, and not excluding many of our children. The other part of it that I spoke about briefly is the culture of opportunity. How do we create a culture that really, truly states that opportunities with a big sign lives and resides in our schools and in our communities. Too many times we have situations that really give what I call the double message. One phrase that I commonly see is when people say, gee, we're looking for qualified people, particularly when they have a candidate of color. They said, we want diversity, but we want a qualified person, as if there was some disconnect between diversity and quality and qualifications. Language and culture, and the reason I emphasize language, we have, as Paulo Freire says, the language of oppression. And we have done so little to really connect and make sure that we ourselves, as people of color, have not internalized that language of oppression and continue to use it and continue to expand on its use. Too many times, besides the language and culture, we forget to start early and extend the opportunities. Starting early and extending opportunities. Somebody clearly spoke about early childhood. Well, it's even before early childhood. What about parents that prior to even thinking about their future, their child, begin when the mother knows that she is having this child? What is it that we do in society to support that mother in knowing the skills that it takes to raise that child for parents, their children? So starting early is really starting early. It's not at the pre-K door. It's really starting early. Extended to me means that you don't think of schools as containers. We contain too many children. Open up the walls, open up the minds, open up the possibilities. Somebody talked about creativity. We can't have creativity when sometimes what we measure are the things in the container. It's the labels in the container. And sometimes we have a disrespect for the way certain cultures learn and the way certain cultures and language, schooling many times, as Lisa Delpit says, are set up to provide an advantage for some and a disadvantage for others. Schools are places that, for example, the direct language, again, language and culture, the direct language is not respected. It is the indirect language that becomes respected. And so in schooling, when a child, and I'll give you one concrete example, when the teacher says, would you like to put your crayons away? And the child says, no, the child becomes oppositional. In fact, in that child's language at home, the use of direct language may be the prominent use, not the indirect. Would you like to go to bed? No. Go to bed. That is the direct language. So that dissonance, that disconnect between direct language and indirect language, we have really not done a good enough job to make sure that schools become places that really allow for cultures that are direct and cultures that are indirect really flourish. And finally, and I can go on and on and on about all the lack of resources, broadband, infrastructure, equipment, all the weapons that we use to weaponize, to exclude, to deny, and then to tell the story that these children are not good enough, or that somehow when you start the race and you give certain students all the benefits and they take off and they start the race and the other children see those children down the road running the race and have to run 3 times as hard. And many times they do it, and we don't even recognize it. Well, I have to tell you, I was that kid who came from Puerto Rico, didn't speak a word of English at the age of 9 years old. And I ran my race, and I kept saying, I'll be darned if somehow I cannot, even after my bachelor's degree, my 3 master's degree, that institution called Harvard is a place where I cannot put my signature. And I did. And I will tell you, I want every single brown and black child in this state to be able to run their race, but to run it with the tools, with the support, with the wind behind their backs, and in a place that has a mat that said, you are welcome, and this is your place to succeed. Short of that, short of investments, short of infrastructures that are not metal detectors that say, guess what? We don't trust you. Before we can educate you, you have to go through a metal detector. Short of all the underlying messages that we give to our certain communities, but we don't give them to the others, we have failed as a society. And until we reckon with everything that we have done as a common unity, as a community, we will not be doing what I will call the kind of work and the kind of job that we need to do together collectively, all of us, in investing in a new, what I will call a new place where our future and our children can reside and have hope and have all the things that they need to be successful. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rosa. Thank you for your words. Thank you for your spirit. Thank you for your support. And I hope you stay in your job for many years. Thank you for being with us tonight. And thank you to all the panelists. We're now entering into the Q&A session of our evening. And my sister, Beth Wilson, also from UUP, will moderate the discussion. Beth.
Okay, thanks, Donna, and thanks to all the wonderful panelists. I'm looking forward to having a bit of some conversation here. Anybody who's tuning in, if you want to drop a question in the chat, I'll be monitoring that as we go through. So I'd encourage you to do that, and otherwise, then we will be also having a conversation among the people who were on the panel. I'm going to start. This is what, Sparrow? Sparrow has a question. Okay, we'll get to you.
I have a question, but I can wait.
Yeah, well, I get to do my rant now, Sparrow.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry for that.
So, having heard all of the kind of wonderful information from everybody here, one of the things that really strikes me is that public education is the quintessential example of the common good that we're talking about. And as I think Chris pointed out, it's not something that should be commodified, right? And we live in a society that has spent a tremendous amount of time. The last 40 years, I have watched everything being boiled down to a bottom line. Everything, like as Sparrow pointed out in his introduction, the post office, all kinds of basic functions of the society, people start looking to that, that they should be a profit-making enterprise, that government should be run like a business. This neoliberal mindset is something that reduces all of us, all of our educators, all of our students, everyone is turned into some kind of a number on an Excel spreadsheet that it has to be used to justify your existence somehow. As the chapter president at New Paltz for our faculty and staff union, UUP, I am painfully aware of how badly we do in terms of valuing the work of our brothers and sisters in higher ed. Chris was very modest, but I can tell you on our campus, the base rate for an adjunct, many of whom, like Chris, have PhDs in hand, to teach a 3-credit course, 15 weeks, including the final, of a whole group of young college freshmen, juniors, whatever, to teach an entire 3-credit course. You get paid the princely sum of $3,300, right? And the starting salaries for our tenure track people in most of our disciplines, it's around $56,000 as a starting salary at New Paltz and at SUNY. And these are people who are walking in with PhDs and 6-figure student loan debt. And it's kind of insane that this is what goes on, this level of exploitation. I've heard our administration periodically complain about the fact that, oh, our budget is so, their biggest cost is paying people, paying labor. Well, I'm sorry, education is labor intensive. If it's not labor intensive, I don't know what you're doing as a teacher. So basically, the question facing us, we're in the middle of this crisis, this economic crisis that's generated by and compounded by all the constraints and everything we're experiencing because of the pandemic. But to me, the question we're facing right now is education important to us? Is equity important to us? And what is this going to look like when we come out the other side of this? Currently, the way the budget cuts are coming down, the way everybody's getting slashed and burned, and we're waiting still at New Paltz to hear the really bad news from the state, which I know is going to be really bad news when it arrives. It's all about cut, 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 cut. What system are we going to have for public education, K-12 and higher education, if we slash it to ribbons now? And I've been seeing people walking away from the career of being an educator. It's the time to take their retirement. It's the time not to go into education because what's the future of it? It's looking really, really bleak. And in 5 years' time, when hopefully we've got the pandemic situation sorted out and we really want to, have a society, what are we going to have left to make that society happen with? So I would contend at this point, budgets are expressions of political will. And that's a fundamental lesson that we in the labor movement have to move forward with. We have to begin to leverage our power as the people who make everything happen. We are the labor that makes everything possible. How can we leverage ourselves, the 99%, against the 1%, against the billionaires who are making a killing, literally and figuratively, in the middle of a pandemic on the backs of the rest of us? These are political decisions that are going to have to be made in Albany and in Washington. And the question facing us, I think, is how can we get the powers that be to understand that we are actually the power that flows into the system that enables everything else. Okay, so that's my little soapbox moment. And so I'm not seeing any questions coming up in the chat per se. Do we have, we had such a wonderful group of speakers. Do you have questions for each other you'd like to ask? Yes, Sparrow, go.
My question is for Juanita. I know as educators, we have a lot of fear going back to school, the unknowns of the COVID, but we know that our the children need to be educated, and the lack of education is is causing damage. But our migrant families, now they have the fear of COVID. Now on top of that, maybe the fear of ICE, and all the normal insecurities of being a teenager. And what can we do as an education, as a community and educators to help those students? I don't know if you can answer that, Juanita, but if you have any thoughts.
Sorry, my camera's off. The sun went down, so you can't even see me anyways. I was one of those kids when I was in high school. And I think the most important thing is having your students' backs, right? Like, the people that were there for me when I was in high school were my school counselor and then also the college counselors of the schools that I wanted to go to. And they pushed me and supported me every step of the way, helped me find scholarships and helped me find support that I needed until I got my papers. Because other than that, we're living life, trying to live life like any other student normally. A lot of the students that are undocumented don't, like, the only people that know are their school counselors. Everyone else just thinks they're a student like any other. So the support I would say is, the general support you would give to any other student. Don't treat them like an other person, right? Othering students, especially at the vulnerable ages in middle school and high school, will make them feel even more vulnerable. So give them equal support. And, there may be students that, as we all know as educators, they come and they lash out and they're frustrated. And it could be because of all these different stresses that are happening on at home. So like I mentioned before when I was speaking, one of the biggest tools we could use during these battles is patience. And I know that it's frustrating working in these systems. Like, we don't get the financial support that we need. We don't get the emotional support that we need, or support from our political leaders. But we can't take that out on our children, on the children that we're educating and the children that we're supporting. We still have to work our best to be patient and not put any of our stress onto them. And I know one of the biggest complaints that I hear from young people is like, we don't want to hear about everything that's going on at home. Like, it just makes us more stressed out, and we don't want to listen to you at the end of the day if you're, bringing all of your woes to school. So, they value their education, and the more emphasis that we put into that, I think that'll be better for the young people.
Okay, I'd just like to add to that. There's been some really interesting examples in recent memory of teachers bargaining for the common good. I'm thinking about things like in the Chicago Teachers Union went on strike recently, and their demands were not only for their own pay and benefits. It was also to ensure that there would be an equitable housing policy in the city of Chicago, because their students have to go home after school, when we're not in a pandemic, and now they're stuck in these places, right? So the idea of having a union be able to also, a teachers union, for instance, like some of the local teachers unions in Sullivan County make noise about the broadband issues because it's impacting their work, but it's impacting their students. And it's that fundamental question of equity that we keep circling around. So I think there are powerful ways that the labor movement can actually help to make a big difference with these things. I don't know if anybody else has a comment.
Yeah, I wanted to speak to advocacy and education and how it's just unique. Oftentimes when you talk about other issues, there's two sides of it, right? Either you're for gun control or you're not. And when it comes to education, everyone in elected office says, yes, I support schools. No one ever says, I don't like schools or schools should be defunded. They all give us a yes and a smile. They all want to have lobby visits and take pictures with children, want to be loved by the teachers and the teachers union. But the betrayal comes, and I think, Anthony pointed out, in the silence, right? they don't speak up for schools. They don't go to the bat for education. They don't get aggressive about delivering for our schools. And so in their, yes, of course we love our schools, we want to do more, but with their no action and follow up behind that, oftentimes in budgets, our schools get screwed. And so it's a hard issue to advocate for because everyone will claim that they love you. They love schools, they love education, and they want to be with us and for us. And very few people actually go and take that into action. And very few elected officials really are held accountable for their inaction on schools and on school funding. And I know one of the things that we're thinking of AQE is just being a bit more aggressive with our state legislators around holding them accountable to what happens in Albany and not allowing elected officials to play the blame game. Oh, well, it's not the assembly, it's the Senate. It's not the Senate, it's the governor. And they just drive you in circles. And it's like, it's all of you. This power structure at the end is harming our children, it's harming our families, it's harming our communities. And we cannot allow that to persist. And the most powerful coalition that we've seen in the past that New York does not have as well is the coalition structure when you bring the unions and the parents and the students together. That structure is probably one of the most effective organizing structures. And we had that at some point in New York and it has dissolved because of issues between parents, communities, and the union. But we need to get back to a point where we're all advocating together with the full force of what the union has and the union might around the ferocity of parents and what they can do and bring to the table with the energy of our youth and how they are so creative in the fight. And then when all of us come together with unified demands for the collective good, then we see transformational change. But as long as they keep us pitted against each other, as long as they keep us in silos, we will never get to winning systemic change and moving the needle in the right direction.
Yeah, I just want to add the conversation you just had also creates, for example, in certain communities, people, you know, it's almost like the mathematical equation that nobody wants to give up, right? So it also ends up becoming a sense of, most of us have heard the term, you know, in some communities we educate them at $13,000 and in others at $34,000. And then the expectation is the same for those two. And we're shocked. I mean, I think the thing that is amazing to me is that then we say, what's wrong with those people that we're educating at $13,000? Why can't they perform the same way as the people that we're educating at $34,000? Well, the last time I was on a flight, paying for the seat in the back near the bathroom was not as comfortable as the seat that's either called the business class or the first class. So I think in some ways we're all on the plane, except some are, and I also think that, you know, sometimes they create what I call a little extra leg room and give you a false sense, well, at least I'm not sitting all the way in the back. So I've got that little extra leg room. So you know what? I'm a little bit more comfortable, you know, than the person behind me. Unfortunately, we're on this flight together. And when we look around, they pull the curtain and somebody in the front is getting their food, their drinks, their comfort, their pillows, their music, whatever. And then you have that other group in the middle, right? That, you know, and then you have everybody else in the back, you know, assuming we're, you know, that we look at it. And then we expect when we all land that somehow, yes, we all landed at the same time, but there's a difference. Those that landed and were comfortable are in a different place than those that landed and couldn't even barely move. So in some ways, I think the frustration is also that we keep going around these issues and we do create a little extra leg room for some. And and then we silence, you know, kind of back to what Anthony said, we silence a group because they get a little extra leg room, or in some, you know, some of us have called it a few extra crumbs, right? Whatever way you want to think about the situation. And so that taking of the pie and divvying it up and making sure that, you know, somebody's advocating for theirs and somebody's advocating, you know, and on and on and on, really truly creates a challenge and an assault on the equity issue. Because at the end of the day, we know that there's no way that we can say that $13,000 is an education that equals one that is 35. And by the way, that's not to mention those places and spaces where people go that are spending upwards of 55, 12, you know, it's the famous saying, nobody thinks that small class size matters until your very own has to be in a place where class size matters. You know, that was the big argument I had. I remember way back with Joe Klein, I said, I'm sure you sent your kid to a school that had 10 kids, and yet you will argue that it doesn't matter. Yes, it does, because I bet you dollars to no donut. You know, I'm one that put my very own kid in my own district, in District 8, and he went to my own school. And yet I would look at him and say, you put your kid in a place that you were spending X number of dollars to ensure that your kid could run a better race than my kid. There was no question about it.
Yeah,
so, you know,
that's a great image, Dr. Rosa, about the plane and the different classes in the plane. Although I can tell you, as far as SUNY is concerned, we're looking at a plane that the maintenance on the plane has been underfunded for a decade. And they're making the students pay higher and higher tuition. We've had 7 tuition increases in the last decade and 0 increase in state subsidy for the system, which has basically got us kind of starving ourselves. And the adjunct pay has stayed flat as well, as Chris is pointing out. So, I mean, it's a commonplace now to say that the pandemic has revealed and magnified attention on all of these inequities that have previously existed. But man, oh man, and this is the clear and present danger right now is, as I was saying, that the additional cuts right now are just going to completely destroy the basis that we have for a meaningful public higher education system. I just want to point out, Anthony dropped a link in the chat about the scholar strike, which is next week. I don't know, Anthony, do you want to speak about that a little bit?
Yeah, so I put a link in the chat about the scholar strike, and you can just probably just Google it. I think the hashtag is hashtag scholar strike. But as of last week, remember when the NBA went on strike, there's a professor that came out of University of Pennsylvania, and she was on Twitter, and she said, I wish that, I'm paraphrasing, I wish that there was something that I could also contribute to as well, right? And then over 600 scholars responded and said, let's do something. So now what's going on is on next Monday and Tuesday, there's a strategy of either going on strike and not showing up, or coming to class but centering the classroom content on those 2 days around issues of racial injustice in America, right? So then that is important for us to understand, because it ties into what Beth was talking about earlier, how the teachers and within the education system, she was talking about Chicago, how they're bargaining for the common good. So now you have teachers that are bargaining for things that are going on outside of the academy, right? Because we also, at the end of the day, understand that all of this stuff is connected, right? If you have people that are not doing good outside of the university, right, that's going to have an impact on what's going on inside of the university. And it's important for us to approach that in a way in which we understand that how all of these things are connected.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Donna?
Yeah, and also I agree with everything you said, and I'd also like to comment on our two-party electoral system and the reduction of much of academic activism to lobbying elected officials who don't help us, who don't care about education, again, who give lip service, but we give them our votes. And it's kind of like a bind. What are we supposed to do? We're supposed to vote. And what else are we supposed to do? We're supposed to get everybody else to vote. And so we vote. And then at the end of the day, maybe our candidate gets in, maybe not. But how many of them do anything for education? And yet, do we have an education party? Do we have a labor party? Do we have a coalition of folks, of community members, of educators, of poor people, of brown people, of people who need more than what they're getting? Do we have that coalition that can form itself into a political party who can take on the Republicans and Democrats who year after year after year after election pass us by and take us for granted? No, we don't yet. But isn't that a good goal? Isn't there a need to come out of this vice of two parties who are not going to help us? Just saying.
Okay, thanks, Donna. We're getting towards the end of our time. I just want to ask, I guess, Bianca and Chris, if either of you have some last thoughts before we close up, since I think everybody else has spoken in the Q&A.
I just wanted to say that, not only is COVID, revealing the inequity, but it's compounding it. So even if you look at the reopening issues, right? Some schools have resources and some cushions. Reopening a school right now is a very expensive proposition. And in communities where schools don't have what they need to reopen, the childcare issues are compounded. The access to services is compounded. And this is something that just makes us all fight amongst each other, right? And it's designed that way. So you have a governor that's saying, well, it's up to the schools, like they'll make it happen, right? But there's no money. But if you live in a community that's well-resourced, you're getting state-of-the-art plexiglass shields and whatever, all of the bells and whistles. And it's just, and we're talking about children and education, and the fact that even in the face of something so, just lack of childcare, lack of access, that we are not taxing the rich, and we are fighting amongst ourselves is so, it's just so revealing. And I think we have to connect the dots between all the different school districts. So when you hear about a district upstate that just laid off 300 paras, and you hear about a school in New York City that it can't afford to install, touchless hand sanitizer, we have to connect to that and realize we are all part of the same system. And when that school upstate has just lost 300 faculty, that impacts me, you, all of our children. And we have to stop being so insulated, right? And so this is about my little space right here, because at the end of the day, this is all of us, and we're all impacted. And it's just, I think it could not be clearer than it is right now.
Okay, great. Thanks, Bianca. Chris, did you have any closing thoughts? You're muted.
It's hard to, I feel like, I don't know that I have a whole lot to say that hasn't already been said by, my really awesome co-panelists here. I think if I can sort of give kind of like bottom line thoughts, what I would say is this. One, maybe one thing that we need to do is find a way to disentangle the geography, as I say this as a geographer, to disentangle the geography from the funding of schools. And this is something I say as somebody who teaches at the university level, but who sees the impacts of underfunded schools, at primary and secondary schools, with students who are performing very well in their schools, but are then still underprepared for education. So there has to be a way to decouple the geography of affluence from funding of primary and secondary education. And I think the other thing that we need to do maybe is fight against the idea that and I might take some flack for this, but maybe we need to push back against the idea that education is a vocation, because there is an assumption that if you think of education as a vocation, then it's okay to underpay people. And I think everybody at this table is probably doing a hell of a lot more work than they're actually paid for. And if we're not willing to invest in paying the people who teach our children, then what are we willing to invest in? So, and I don't say this because I want to be rich. I say this because I want to be paid well enough that I can put food on my table and pay my mortgage and still do my job and not have to do 3 other jobs or 2 other jobs. And I think there are a lot of other people, 70% of, university professors are contingent, right? There are a lot of us who are in similar positions. So just, I think my biggest frustration in academia right now is just the sort of devaluing of education and devaluing of the labor of educators. I think that's all I got.
Okay, well that's a great ending point for a labor discussion, Chris. Thanks. So I want to just thank again all of our wonderful panelists and all the tremendous insights people have had. The video of this event is going to be posted on the Hudson Valley ALF YouTube channel. So it'll be living on in posterity, and we can share the links and make sure everybody gets to see it. So have a happy Labor Day weekend, even if you don't get Labor Day off, like I don't because they took it away from me at the college. But anyway, and everybody stay safe and be well. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Arise, ye workers, from your slumber. Arise, ye prisoners of want. That's right. For reason in revolt now thunder. Chains of hatred, greed, and fear. Away with all your superstitions. Serve our masses. Arise, arise. We'll change henceforth the old tradition and spurn the dust to win the prize. So comrades, come on and rally. Then the last fight let us face. The International unites the whole darn human race.